morning, everyone. It's another day and it's a great time to learn again. We are the JEMMB team, Jerry, Emmanuel, Mikey, Marilyn, and Bernadette, and we will discuss the theories of Sikolohiyang Pilipino by Virgilio Enriquez. So this would be the flow of our discussion for today. The table of context, the next one would be the overview, the next one would be the pioneer, introduction, the beginnings, the major characteristics, concepts and examples, a short video, four affiliations, conclusions, and the presentation of group members. So let's have an overview of Filipino psychology, which is also known as Sikolohiyang Pilipino. It is a branch of psychology that originated in the Philippines. The Filipinos' experience, thoughts, and attitude is based on the full exploitation of Filipino culture and language. The theoretical foundation and technique are based on the indigenous people's experiences. It is based on examining historical and socio-cultural realities, learning the local language, comprehending Filipino characteristics, and explaining them from a native Filipino's perspective. The pioneer of Sikolohiyang Pilipino was Virgilio Enriquez and was born in the Philippines, Bulacan region, and has been thought to speak the native tongue fluently by his father since he was a kid. Enriquez was formally initiated into psychology in 1963 when he began teaching at the University of the Philippines. He began using the Filipino language in his teachings as early as 1965. In 1966, he moved to Evanston, Illinois, to earn a master's and eventually a doctoral degree in psychology at Northwestern University. In 1971, Enriquez returned to the Philippines, bringing with him the richness of Western knowledge. His Western education really influenced his teaching and research in psychology to be more Filipino-oriented. He founded the Philippine Psychology Research House, which is also known as PPRH, which subsequently became the Philippine Psychology Research Institute. The Philippine Psychology Research and Training House was established, and it became the repository for materials on Sikolohiyang Filipino, which has grown to over 10,000 references. It also became a place for research with a Filipino viewpoint, as well as for individuals who were inspired by Enriquez's zeal and went on to contribute to Sikolohiyang Filipino's growth. In 1977 to 1982, Enriquez was a chairman of the Department of Psychology. He encouraged pupils to write their papers on Filipino in order to learn essential cultural notions and help the national language thrive. He served as an advisor and reader for Filipino language thesis and dissertations in psychology, linguistics, anthropology, philosophy, and Philippine studies. He taught in De La Salle University, Pamantasan Lungsod ng Maynila, University of Santo Tomas, and Centro Escolar University, and among other places. Enriquez was a prolific scholar who wrote books on indigenous psychology, Filipino personality, language, and political psychology, philosophy and values, cross-cultural psychology, and Filipino-Lohia or Philippine studies, indigenous psychology and national consciousness from colonial to liberation psychology, and chapter addition to Blowers and Turtles. 1987 book are among the titles on the list. Pagbabangong Dangal, which is Indigenous Psychology and Cultural Empowerment, his last publication before his death in 1994, and Psychology Moving East. Enriquez earned various accolades, including fellowships, scholarships, recognitions, and grants both in the Philippines and abroad. He contributed significantly to the understanding of Sikolohiyang Filipino and Asian psychology. In 1982, the National Academy of Science and Technology awarded him the Outstanding Young Scientist of the Philippines award in recognition of his contribution to Sikolohiyang Filipino. Following his death, the National Research Council of the Philippines bestowed upon him the National Achievement in the Social Sciences Award in 1997 for outstanding national achievements in the social sciences. So let's have an introduction. Sikolohiyang Filipino is rooted on the Filipino orientation as understood from a fellow's Filipino's perspective, acknowledging its own history and cultural roots. For centuries, Filipino behavior has been interpreted in Western theories and perspective, which leads to an inaccurate picture of a Filipino. Enriquez soon defined Sikolohiyang Filipino as the study of diwa, which refers to the wealth of ideas referred to by philosophical word of essence, as well as full range of psychological notions. This concept is anchored on assessing historical and sociocultural realities, understanding the local language, unraveling Filipino characteristics, and explaining them through the eyes of the native Filipino. To encourage one's national identity, consciousness, social involvement, and psychology of language and culture.
So let's move on to the beginnings of Sikolohiyang Filipino. Academic psychology or psychology taught in schools was largely Western in theory and approach from the beginning of the times when the Philippines were colonized by Spain and then the United States. Many Filipino intellectuals, including two national heroes, Jose Rizal and Apolinario Mabini, expressed displeasure with Western observers' dismissive interpretations of Filipino behavior. So let's move on with the characteristics. As an indigenous Asian psychology, we have three major characteristics. First is empirical philosophy, which is the academic scientific psychology that involves Ricardo Pascual's views and teachings, logical examination of language. Next is the rational philosophy, which is the psychology and phenomenology, which involves domestic philosophy and clerical position. The third one is liberalism, Philippine propaganda, which involves Philippine heroes, Jacinto Mabini and Del Pilar's writings, and ethnic psychology. Let's proceed with a concept and examples. Sikolohiyang Filipino is an identity, national consciousness, social awareness, language, cultural psychology, and applications, which these concepts are based on the foundations of Filipino psychology, which are health practices, agriculture, art, mass media, and religion. So before we proceed to the next slide, I would like to introduce you a short video that discusses the summary of the theory. So that was an amazing and educational video. So let's proceed with the four affiliations of Sikolohiyang Filipino. The academic scientific psychology, the Western tradition. This was at the same time as in 1876 scientific psychology of German tradition was born, and Western psychology of the primarily American tradition was introduced into Philippine university. Second one is the academic philosophical psychology, the Western, mainly clerical tradition. Under the direction of individual monks and preachers as well as the Jesuits, the University of San Tomas and later on institutes of higher study pursued this goal. In the tradition of the mystic philosophy and psychology, the study of psychology as a component of philosophy persisted. Third one is the psychomedical system, which is the religion as a unifying element and explanation. The fourth one is the ethnic psychology. It is the major foundation of Sikolohiyang Filipinos' efforts to integrate academic, scientific, and academic philosophical traditions into the national tradition of psychology and philosophy as a universal subjects. These streams contain Filipino psychology, derived from language, culture, literature, and other sources, as well as the psychological research systems devised by Filipinos using indigenous elements as foundation. Filipino psychology, as witnessed by outsiders or as felt and articulated by Filipinos, Filipino psychological practice, typically enculturation, socialization, procedures, and proto-clinical practice. So in conclusion, Filipino psychology, also known as Sikolohiyang Filipino, is a branch of psychology that originates from the Philippines, which tackles the experiences, historical and cultural roots, as well as the characteristics and behavior of the indigenous Filipino people, which then was rooted from the exploitation of culture and language, and explain these concepts from the native Filipino perspective. From the foundation of health practices, agriculture, art, mass media, and religion, Sikolohiyang Filipino aims to discuss concepts of identity, national consciousness, social awareness, language, culture, psychology, and application. Sikolohiyang Filipino is a psychological concept that utilizes the psychology taught in the Philippines, which is introduction to psychology. Sikolohiyang Filipino and the psychology of other cultures is a more specific education that Enriquez believes to be more important to comprehend the psychology of people as a whole, rather than a general psychology course. Sikolohiyang Filipino is Enrique's effort to convince people that they should endeavor to understand one another before leaping to assumptions that may be completely incorrect. So that's it. We are the GAMMB team, which involves our leader, Jerry Isan, Emmanuel Heifler, Mikey Vicente, Marilyn Dormido, and Bernadette Plaza. And here's our presentation on Sikolohiyang Filipino. Thank you.